Francisco de Miranda, one of the forerunners of the country, and two famous painters from Venezuela. One is Armando Reverón. Armando Reverón used to paint with his excrement and with natural things.
What?
Reverón. Él pintaba con mierda, o sea, con...
This guy...
Yeah, and with natural things, no? And Cristóbal Rojas. Like two of the major...
Gallery of Art?
National Gallery of Art, new building.
Oh.
Apart from the one over there.
Oh, wow. No, but this is the mural that we're talking about.
Yeah.
I wanted to show you. It's cool. Amazing. It's like a whole...
It's having the most beautiful mural.
Viva. Alright. So Carmelo is translator, fixer, salsa instructor, and history professor.
So first of all, this was painted by the mural painting brigade from the mayor office of Caracas. You have the names of people who painted this. When it used to be in the hands of a pro-government mayor. Now the mayor is from the opposition, and he almost basically made every project disappear.
Oh no!
To do his own agenda, you know? Okay. It's called Alive History. Everything starts with the creation of the world, as you can see. Right? From the plants to the animals. Land full of wealth of every kind. Fruit, your abundance. Our Aboriginal people used to live in harmony without fighting. Resources for that, living in, yes, we could call it socialism, like President Chavez has said in many of his speeches, that we should do like our indigenous people. Because all the resources were there, but there were no fight over them. Be careful. So, we start to see the most prominent figures back then. Among them, one of the Indian chiefs called Huaycaipuro. He's even venerated, for example, by the people that is involved in Santeria. They have groups of deities, no?
Yeah.
That are called the Orishas. And among them, like they integrated the African cult with Venezuelan historical figures. And for example, is venerated Negro Primero, like a prominent black fighter that fought on the side of Bolivar. The one that I told you that before dying, he took his last breath and say, "My captain, I came to say goodbye, because I died. I have died." So Huaycaipuro is also venerated as a deity, no? By many people. So, if you take a look at this part, you can see here the face of the Spaniards coming. to conquer this land.
No?
It's if you have read some of the history, for example, of Mexico, of the Mayan, it was the same like here. They saw all these ships and all these people in brilliant, in shiny armor wardrobes, and they at first they thought they were like gods, no? They were like deities that have come to our land to bring a special message. So they were welcome. But the Aboriginal people ignored the intentions of them, no? Because when they saw this land, they, you know, these Spaniards, they just wanted to get a hold of the treasuries and all the resources. So Christopher Columbus arrives to this land. Christopher Columbus arrives to this land with the help of the Catholic king and queen of Spain from Castilla, Fernando or Ferdinand and Elisabetta. They were like the king and queen of Castilla and Aragon, and they were the ones to provide the funds for Christopher Columbus expedition. Christopher Columbus was looking forward to arrive in the West Indies, and he ended up in this part of the world. Okay?
Here it says just war, mass killing of the indigenous of the Caribbean.
And we start to see in this wall some images that are self-explanatory and messages more or less describing what took place back then. For example, there was an obsession because of a legend that spread among the indigenous people of a place in which all buildings were made out of gold. And this place was El Dorado, like the golden place. So there was like a rush of all these conquerors looking forward to find this city that was completely made out of gold. A true obsession. It says, El Dorado, the marvelous city of gold that only existed within the head of the conqueror. And it's written here. However, not all the barbaric acts of the Spaniards remain in impunity. It's memorable, for example, what happened in Cumaná, a city that was founded in the east of Venezuela, where a group of rebel indigenous people basically burned to ashes a small village that has been built by the conquerors. One of the most terrible things that were made by the conquerors was also linked to the existence of pearls in our ocean, because they would make these indigenous men and women to go in the water so that they can get the pearls, and many men and women of Aboriginal origin died, basically drowned, just to satisfy the thirst for resources of the conqueror.
Free political prisoners. Yeah, but...
No, and you have this character here was a priest. His name is Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. He somehow made possible to soften the treatment that was given to the indigenous people, because at first the Spaniards tried to do the same that was done with the folks that were brought from Africa. But the Aboriginal peoples from this part of the world were not as physically strong. So he wrote a sort of document trying to enhance more the conversion of these indigenous folks into the religion of Catholicism instead of killing them or slaughtering them, and make them servants and not slaves because they were not they were not strong enough. And you can see here Carlos V. The king was God, and therefore he was the law. But here it's written, but since the king was so far away, here basically people did what they wanted. So at this point they start to describe in the mural the period of the colony. You start to see here the mixed people was born, because with the arrival of Spaniards, it happened something different of what happened in the United States, in a sense like, as far as I know, in the US, there was a massive slaughtering of indigenous people. Here, yes, people died, but a racial melting pot started at this point. Black slaves were brought from Africa to do the job that Aboriginals couldn't do, since they were physically stronger. And a new class is born from those that came first to the continent, from the whites that were brought to this continent from Spain. So these people were called the masters of cocoa, because they were the owners of bigger land properties where cocoa and coffee were cultivated. And obviously a more and more important role of the Catholic priests, calling people to have faith and to embrace Catholicism. In 1795, the first rebellion takes place. A man who was a product of this melting pot. Sambo is the son of an Indian with black. Because you have also Pardo. The Pardo were the result of black and white. So there were different, let's call them social classes at that time. You have the blancos de orilla, who were like the shore whites that were brought from Spain. Those that were born in these lands were the Creole, los criollos, Creole whites. Then you have, like in this classification of social classes, Creole whites have the economic power, but no political power. You have the shore whites, or blancos de orilla, that were brought from Spain. They held political power, but they didn't have the economic power, because they didn't own any land. They were just representatives of the interest of the Spanish crown. And then you have the mixed people, like the Sambos and Pardos, who were basically servants, because they were not slaves, because they were not black, but more or less they have the same level of Indians, of indigenous people. Okay, so this guy attempted the first rebellion with a group of black slaves, and he was caught and killed, and his arms and legs were in the 4 cardinal points of the city to launch a warning to all those who wanted to attempt a new rebellion. Okay? Example Chirin. Okay? And here the priest is saying, you should have faith. And then the indigenous people are saying, well, at least we can have something. So the a whole wave of commercial activity starts, and it's open the Royal Guipuzcoana Company in La Guaira, near the airport, in which basically the General Captainy or Capitanía General of Venezuela becomes an important commercial spot to send goods to Spain and receive them as well. And then is born the Holy Inquisition. That was not holy at all. To punish any person who dared to oppose the church power. Okay? I don't know if you remember Torquemada, who was like the most famous inquisitor.
I know this stuff.
Huh?
Venezuela.
Yeah. So they would say it was not holy at all, the Inquisition.
Miranda!
And then this is our people praise a lot Bolivar, but in my opinion, in my humble opinion, this is the most important historical character of this country. Francisco de Miranda. He was the first to bring a flag for this country, and from his ideals comes the idea of the Colombia, or a sort of union of republics from this part of the world to counteract the big foreign powers. Francisco de Miranda spoke several languages. He fought in the War of Independence of the United States. He fought along with the French in the French Revolution. He fought for the Russian Empire. It seems some people say he had an affair with Catherine, the emperor. So, you know, in the early days we Venezuelans were around.
Oh yeah.
He was one of the founders.
Life lovers.
He was one of the founders of the Freemasonry in England, and he lived in England for a while.
What was his name?
Francisco de Miranda.
And he was betrayed by Bolivar.
And at some point, yeah, he was betrayed. Some people say by Bolivar, but you know, he was betrayed by a group of Creole whites that didn't like the idea of having him as one of the leaders, since he was not pure Creole white.
What was
Because
he?
his father was from the Canary Islands in Spain, and then he was not considered part of the aristocrats that you know, wanted to carry out the revolution, let's call it that way, to separate from the Spanish crown. Okay, that is why you see here. You know, you recognize this, no, from the French Revolution. La memoria. Okay, cool. Then we have the series of the independence cards, with Bolivar as the most prominent figure. Sucre. You have Andrés Bello, who was one of the teachers of Simón Bolívar. He proposed, and he is recognized in the Spanish world as one of the best. He wrote one of the best Spanish grammar books. La gramática Andrés Bello.
Ah.
Yeah. Andrés Bello and Simón Rodriguez, who was who later on changed his name to Samuel Robinson. And the Mission Robinson, to teach people how to write and read, is named after him, because he, like Pablo Freire and other people, let's say, was a vanguardist with regards to the education field.
And was he the man, Simon Boulevard? That was his mentor, right?
Yes, both. And Simón Rodriguez was along with Bolívar in Rome, in the Sacro Mountain, when Bolívar took oath and said, "My soul will never go to rest until my land is free."
Wow.
You know that, no? El juramento del Monte Sacro in Roma.
No.
Bolívar is with Simón Rodriguez.
Oh.
And he says, I will not give rest to my soul until my land is free. No hay reposo a mi conciencia ni reposo a mi alma hasta que... So, here we have, after the independence period where we fought with the Spaniards and kicked these people out of the continent, a whole complicated century starts, which is the 19th century, the century of war, where we have to start a lot of military leaders, what we call caudillos, fighting because they all wanted to hold power. At this point, the dream of Miranda and the dream of Bolívar disappears, because Santander, which is a hero for Colombia, betrays Bolívar, and even Páez, who has been a brave fighter along with Bolívar, they all wanted to have like the little portion of power. So all of the countries split into independent territories. That is why it's written here in this medal, in the heart of José Antonio Páez, it's written, now the homeland, I'm the homeland, I'm the homeland, just like Louis XIV in France. L'état c'est moi. Well, the homeland, I am the homeland.
What does that mean?
Says. Huh?
What does that mean?
Yo soy la patria. La patria soy yo. Como, I am the state, like Louis XIV.
Oh, like fascist.
Yeah. No, and like, yeah. And you have, for example, the Conservative Party here in Venezuela saying, well, ladies and gentlemen, now that we have become independent, I wanted to tell you that all that shit about freedom and equity was not serious stuff. And Bolívar, we kicked this folk out of here.
Afuera!
And the Republic of Venezuela is founded during a meeting called La Cosiata, which was the separation of the Great Colombia into Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, etc. So you have this phenomenon called caudillismo, that were basically military leaders fighting against each other for the control of the country. So they took turns in ruling Venezuela during the 19th century. It was a bloody century. And then we have a very interesting period, which is the Federal War. Here we have Ezequiel Zamora, who's an important figure in our history, because he led a movement of men and women that wanted to be free and owners of their land. And then there's a famous song, I'll try to translate it. It was a war chant. It says, el cielo está nublado, anuncia tempestad, oligarcas temblar, viva la libertad.
The sky is cloudy.
The sky is cloudy. It announces a storm. Oligarchs tremble.
Oligarchs
Don't
tremble.
leave freedom.
Land and free men.
Free land and free men and women.
And now, so Braulio, that we know, he's a representative. He works in the Campesino Front, which is named after this hero. And their their new chant is not just free land and free men. It's tierra, hombres y mujeres libres, which is free land, free men, free women. They include women.
Where is that guy on this picture here? Is there a picture of him up here? Not really, huh?
Which one is Ezekiel Zamora?
No, he's not here.
Oh, he's not pictured.
Just represent.
I translated the script of that movie.
When slavery was ended? Is that big deal?
Okay.
Yeah.
It's in 1854, the abolition of slavery.
Yeah. Yeah.
So imagine,
Even though
Bolivar had decreed the liberation of slaves, but it didn't happen until this period, in 1854, like 20 years after Bolivar have died. Okay, then we have, at the end, the big federal contradiction. The only result of this fight were widows and orphans. So a lot of men killed during the war. That was the result of war. Then we have the General Joaquin Crespo. After all this period of military leaders fighting against each other, and his obsession of making Caracas a second Paris. And that is why you see that most of the architecture from that period, like the capital, is more or less oriented towards making Caracas like a second Paris. Caracas, as Guzmán Blanco would have loved it. So he has this obsession now with the French culture. The 19th century comes to an end, it starts the 20th century, and bingo, we discovered oil. And the first oil well is drilled.
In what year?
In 1903, I think the first. It's an important period because there was a president called Cipriano Castro, who was well known for having like big ass parties and a lot of, women. In fact, he ended up suffering and dying from a sexual transmission disease, and he's very remembered because during this period of time the country was heavily indebted, and all of our coast at some point was blocked by the Dutch, by the English, and by the Germans, because Venezuela was obliged to pay. And there's a famous declaration that he wrote that we saw the other day in the radio in 23. He wrote that declaration. And at some point, Cipriano Castro, this president, decides to take a trip to Europe, and his best friend, General Juan Vicente Gómez, takes power and keeps him in exile. Okay? Juan Vicente Gómez, the first dictator of Venezuela in the 20th century, remained in power for 27 years. He paid off the foreign debt. Paid off the foreign debt.
Juan Vicente Gómez.
Yes. But, yeah, and at this, under his administration, oil was discovered. He gave concessions to the Creole Petroleum Corporation and to Royal Dutch Shell.
By paying off the debt, did that establish him as having power?
Sorry?
By him paying off the debt, did that establish him as being the powerful one?
Yeah, he kept power for 27 years and ruled the country as if it was like a big ranch. A lot of ignorance and illiteracy all over Venezuela. Okay, and this was a famous prison where everyone who disagreed with the dictator was sent in an island, La Rotunda. In 1936, people start to protest, the first oil strike starts, and the dictator dies, but other other military figures take power. We have General Eleazar López Contreras and Isaías Medina Angarita. They were militaries, but from this period of time, this whole idea of making Caracas and the country in general a more modern place started. Some people say that from this period, which is almost 1940, the plans for the metro start.
Wow.
So Gomez dies, and from this period is the famous painter Reverón, the one that painted with excrement. Huh? And some democratic.
Why is Lopez Contreras saying he said I had to face
Because people used to make fun of him.
Oh, he does have like a
He was like
face. Yeah, big bird
big,
beak.
So okay. So what happens is that democratic elections are organized, and there's the famous novelist and writer Rómulo Gallegos that won the elections, but immediately is overthrown by a military group that, along with some civilians, decide to take power. And in fact, Marcos Pérez Jiménez, the second dictator of the 20th century, takes the power. This period is famous because many people that disagree with the dictatorship disappeared or ended up in the jails of an infamous security law enforcement group that was called National Security. And the head of this group was particularly cruel. His name was Pedro Estrada. This guy in white. Pedro Estrada. Okay. He ruled the country until January the 23rd, 1958, when the dictatorship is overthrown by a group, again, of civilians and all the political parties, even the conservatives and communists, everyone together to kick him out. He ended up taking a lot of money out of our country and ended up living in Spain. However, one thing that could be positive, or some people say when they see crime and things here in Caracas, they say like, oh, during Pérez Jiménez there were no thieves, no insecurity, and like most of the infrastructure that you see today, most of the highways, the plans for the metro was built during his dictatorship. So some people remember him with, melancholy. Okay?
Melancholy. Oh, it's even up in
Melancholy. Not melancholy. Okay. So, okay. January 23rd, dictatorship is overthrown. People had the hope, oh, wow, now we're free. Now there's no dictatorship. But what do we do with freedom now? So, the two most prominent political groups in this country sat down and signed something called the Punto Fijo Pact. Basically a bipartisan politics agreement in which they would basically take turns in power, which was basically what happened in the next 40 years. Yes. So that is why like all these values and all this hope, ended up vanishing, and some people like this mouse here started to ask, and what happened with all these hopes? Because what we have next is a group of politicians enriching themselves, and we have proposals that failed continuously because, there was this agrarian reform of 1960 that ended up making the rich people richer and getting a hold of bigger pieces of land. Rómulo Betancourt is famous for two things. First, for what was called la pacificación, the peacemaking initiative that basically consisted in bombing the mountains where guerrilla fighters would hide, because this period is precisely when the Cuban Revolution is taking place, and Venezuela was perceived as the second place where the revolution could happen. So the instructions of the U.S. Department of State was annihilate any possibility of a revolution happening in Venezuela. This is, I think, the period in the U.S. of McCarthyism, right?
McCarthyism,
Yes. So, in 1976, takes place the nationalization of oil after a revision of the concession agreement with the foreign companies, because we were basically getting 1% of the revenues. So there is the declaration. This is the first presidency of Carlos Andrés Pérez, and there was this agreement called the 50-50, so that foreign companies would take 50% and we would remain with 50%. Okay? And this is the period of Carlos Andrés Pérez when he speaks about the full employment policy. This was the thing that Charlie mentioned of having an elevator and 16 operators for the same elevator, which was totally ridiculous. But that could happen back then because of the excess of revenues, the surplus, because of the creation of the OPEC and the 1973 war in the Middle East, which, you know, rendered possible an unexpected increase on the prices of oil. And now some stupid people tries to ruin this. They say it's written, and now the ones robbing oil will be 100% Venezuelans, and some opposition wrote here Chavistas. Then you have the 70s with our famous protest singer Ali Primera, who is well known for this song Yankee Go Home, Yankee Go Home, Yankee Go Home.
And also,
and he wrote a song called The Roof of Carton.
yeah. Roof of what?
Carton?
A cardboard.
Huh?
Cardboard.
Cardboard. Cardboard.
You know that song, Casas de Cartón? Qué triste.
How's that? The rain.
It's famous.
Yeah.
Wait, explain this guy, Mr. Miami, dude.
Oh, okay. Remember during the day that you arrived, I was speaking about full employment policy, surplus, and a lot of money all over Venezuela. And this guy is a representation of the "It's cheap, it's cheap, give me two. Está barato, dame dos." I love Miami, and you know, like most of Venezuelans going to Miami, going to Aruba, spending. No culture of saving. So it's written here, give me two, it's cheap. And we have, during the 80s, what was called the Black Friday, which was the devaluation of the currency. Remember that we came from having a 4.30 rate of exchange, 4.30 per dollar, and a very high purchasing power of Venezuelans. This declines dramatically, and February the 27th of 1989 takes place, better known as the Caracazo, when Caracas streets burn. And lots of people died, looting, and most of the things that we are familiarized with that basically brought the revolution to Venezuela. Because people
came down from the hills and they never went back.
Exactly. Thank you. And well, this is Venezuela nowadays, trying to do new things, trying to have faith, trying to make another possible world. I hope you liked it.
Thank you.
Yay!
Sorry for my English at this hour.
Not a problem.
It was perfect. Thank you. Nice tour. That was really interesting.
I learned lots.
Gosh. Wow, we should have done that at the beginning.
I was curious, like, really dumb. What was Bolivar's ethnicity? Was he... Yeah.
White Creole.
Creole, so completely white?
Yeah, white.
Yeah, but born here.
Spanish born.
Born here, but like, yeah, it's, in fact, if you try